Today we're going to discuss some of the details of the EternalBlue exploit that was released last year and has caused havoc over pretty much the last year and a half in various different forms. We'll look at how we can develop our own skills in analysis both of exploits and malware, looking specifically at EternalBlue and how those skills can be translated into other potentially malicious files. So, a quick intro. My name's McCall. I'm a cybersecurity analyst at Riot Games. I shout about security stuff on Twitter fairly often and fairly shouty. So if you have any questions after this, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'm more than happy to answer them. So a lot of you over the past year may recognize some of these headlines. There's been numerous wormed ransomwares, crypto miners distributed across the internet, and the media, as usual, picks up on the boring bits. Ransomware is going to ransom. What a surprise. We all know ransomware is going to do that. Crypto miners are going to mine Monero and feed organized crime. Cool. The really interesting bit, at least in my opinion, is how these pieces of malicious code are spread between the machines, and that's how we come to our exploits. So I'll hopefully give you some insight into how those interesting aspects work and what we can do to protect against them. So I'll take a little bit of history and look back. Some of you may be partially aware of what happened at the beginning of 2017. Some of you may not, so bear with me while I go through it. In approximately August 2016, there was a black market auction where an unknown group purportedly had stolen some governmental exploits, operational documents, exploit code, and other assorted files. They put these up for auction, presumably attempting to get the intelligence agencies to reach out to them and try and prevent them from leaking the information. As we know, that very rarely works. Like, you pay them and then they release the stuff anyway. That's kind of the cycle of bad guy life and what we do. So, as I said, there were no bites, and approximately April 14th, 2017, a group known as Shadow Brokers stepped forward and said, okay, we've had no bites, no one's said they want to prevent us from releasing this information, so we're just going to release it anyway. And that they did. They dumped a whole bunch of exploit code, operational documents, Swift banking information onto GitHub and various other locations, and we started going through it. One of the very interesting pieces about this specific dump was when it happened, a lot of security researchers in the industry turned around and said, these aren't going to be that interesting. They're all old code exploits and we're not going to see them used. That tune changed pretty quickly. So overall, there were approximately 35 different pieces of exploit code released, targeting everything from core operating systems to web servers. There was an exploit for Kerberos and everything from Windows XP all the way up to Windows 10. When we started to fully analyze what was in this dump, the initial researchers' response of there's going to be nothing interesting changed so very quickly. When we started looking at the Eternal series of exploits, so there's EternalBlue, Eternal Champion, Eternal Romance, all targeting different versions of SMB and different versions of Windows, providing complete code execution. Of those 35 different pieces of code and different exploits, there were 4 very specific ones that I want to step in and talk about and give you a little bit of information around. So the first was FuzzBunch, which for anyone who is familiar with Metasploit, it's an exploitation platform that the analysts of what we are supposing is the NSA, was who we were told this exploit dump was taken from. Hasn't been confirmed yet, so let's not point fingers. It was an exploitation platform that they created to run these exploits and utilize them in their operations. Again, very similar to the basic operation of Metasploit. You select your exploit, select your target, and you run it. Simple 2-button exploitation. Secondly, was Dander Sprids, which was a fully functioning C2 solution. It was effectively a single pane of glass that you could use to run operations where you wanted to compromise machines, maintain persistence, maintain identification of what you'd compromised, and record your operational documents. It was a fully functioning single pane of glass that could be used for exploitation, analysis, and detection of targets. The last two we're going to dig into a lot more as the presentation goes through. The first being double pulsar, which is a non-persistent backdoor Trojan. It was the initial payload dropped when you exploited one of the Windows targets using one of these exploits. And finally, the subject of our talk, EternalBlue. It's an SMB version 1, version 2 exploit, allowing remote code execution. All of these were released in completely functioning binary format. You didn't have to compile anything. You got an executable, you ran it, and you could compromise the machine. It was a fun couple of weeks playing with exploits. So taking a look back to how the media reported these, there are three big instances that we saw, and the biggest of which I'm sure the majority of you have heard about and have looked at, was WannaCry. Was a wormed ransomware that hit Europe and Russia specifically very heavily, and was eventually impactful in the United States as well. Once it had compromised the machine, it used EternalBlue to propagate laterally like wildfire within a network. Secondary was a viral crypto miner called Adelkaz. It was a Monero miner. So if anyone who's not familiar with Monero, it's an alternative crypto coin that was being used fairly heavily within organized crime. And once again, Adelkaz was one of the first pieces of malicious code to be identified to use EternalBlue. It in fact came out a couple of weeks before WannaCry was found. And after people started to build detections to identify if WannaCry was spreading, we started to pick up this crypto miner sitting in the background. And finally, when we moved to something much more recent, at the beginning of this year, this is another year after this exploit set was released, F5 Labs identified a Apache Struts vulnerability codenamed Zealot that was using EternalBlue to move laterally within a network, and once again, mining Monero. The use of EternalBlue within these miners to mine cryptocurrency and then fund organized crime has been almost a continual pattern within the use of these exploits once they were released. And again, as you've heard me say, lateral movement has been almost every case we've seen EternalBlue used since it was released. It does work, obviously, across the internet against a Windows target, but the regularity of the use of this has been so minimal. We also believe that Telefonica, when they were compromised with WannaCry initially, were compromised with a different method, potentially phishing, and then the exploit was dropped and then spread laterally within their network. So, stepping into EternalBlue itself. As I mentioned, it's an exploit targeting Windows SMB versions 1 and versions 2 and provides remote code execution on your victim machine. For those of you who administer Windows networks, you know how common Windows SMB is. It's used for everything from file transfer to Windows domain services. It's everywhere within your network if you don't properly manage it, even if you do properly manage it. And again, if you manage these services, you're aware of the ports that they use, TCP 445.139. The standard targeted port has also been seen to apparently target RDP, though its effectuality has not been as good. So in order to understand how the exploit functions, we need to understand how data transfer is done within SMB. So SMB data is encapsulated within packets known as the empty-trans packet. These are the data transfer packets which are established after your SMB session is created. The amount of data that you have to transfer across your SMB protocol may, of course, be too much for a single packet to handle. So instead of having a repetition of that single packet, you have what's called NT-trans2 packets, which are the later part of the protocol, which does the heavy lifting for the majority of the data transfer. The amount of data you can transfer within an NT-trans packet is set with the SMB max buffer size value, which is part of the protocol. And this is important when we move on to the next steps on how the exploit functions when the data is transferred. So EternalBlue itself exploits a memory overflow via the malformed NT-trans2 packet header. This then allows, once the packets are reformed in memory, for a jump to our malicious shellcode, which then allows our payload to be executed. The initial NT-trans packets are padded to their maximum size with null value, with just plain zeros. And then the malicious code is placed into that trans2 packet with a malformed header. The malformed header includes the pointer to the variable section of memory where the shellcode is placed and allows that for execution. The shellcode and payload in this instance is the double pulsar backdoor. Double pulsar itself is a quite ingenious piece of code. For anyone who hasn't looked at it, double pulsar itself, when the memory overflow takes place and the shellcode is executed, that memory space is freed up and double pulsar itself becomes resident within SMB's memory space. You have no extra process, you have no extra bound ports. All of the processing for double pulsar is done within SMB itself. So your data transfer for SMB is unaffected. You can still use the victim compromised machine to transfer data to and from and use it as you would normally. However, if you send very specific opcodes to that server, the double pulsar Trojan will pick that up and take action based on the content of those packets. So its detection, and actually detecting when a machine is being compromised, unless you have a copy of the double pulsar Trojan itself, is exceptionally difficult. The functionality of the backdoor itself, double pulsar is non-persistent. So when you reboot a machine, you lose your compromise. So as a long-term persistence or re-access to a machine method, it's not the best. However, it does completely remove itself if you are compromising a workstation, for example, and moving laterally within someone's network. You take a couple of hops, a machine is rebooted, you still may have access to a later one, and your tracks have been cleared up in the route you've taken. As it shows, we have customizable processing command line options for uploaded DLLs, which is the primary functionality of the backdoor. You compromise the machine, the backdoor is dropped, and then you upload later payloads to take further actions on the machine. And those payloads can be uploaded as DLLs or raw shellcode. The DLLs were most often generated through dander splits, as far as you're able to find with the operational documents that were released. And when we've done examples in testing, we've been using Meterpreter, which functions just as easily when you combine it with the Metasploit platform, which is what I'll use in the example that I have here. I apologize for you at the back. I hope it's going to be clear, but it may not be. On the top left, we have an attacker box using Metasploit. We're literally just going to use this as a handler. It will allow our connection back from the victim machine. An attacker on the right, which we use the Fuzzbunch platform we talked about earlier, which you'll see exactly how easy these exploits are to run. And if you think about how easy it is just to stick an IP address and a port in, how easily you can script that and have it automated in another method. And finally, the victim, for anyone unaware and unfamiliar with Process Monitor, it looks a little out of focus, but watch for the green flash in the second half of the pane there. You'll see the process being created when we connect with our secondary payload, and you'll see the shell being connected back to the Metasploit box in the top corner. And this was done fairly slowly and in a non-scripted fashion, so that you can see the basic steps that you undergo in exploitation using EternalBlue and double pulsar. However, putting these into a scripted fashion, it can be executed immediately. I think the time it took for WannaCry to go from initial drop and infection to spread into a new machine was a matter of seconds. That exploitation was so incredibly fast, which is why a lot of people had a lot of trouble mitigating and protecting against it. So in the top corner, again, for those unfamiliar with Metasploit, we're just putting together a listener so that once our Meterpreter payload is executed, it'll connect back to that machine and we can do whatever we like with the victim. It will just sit there and wait for its connection. Hopefully you can see it, but EternalBlue, the people who created it were fairly nice and provided a lot of information as to exactly how it functions. There's different options. It's not like some of these exploits you can see that have been created by a researcher somewhere. The amount of options and configurability of the EternalBlue exploit allows so much customization in the targets you are attacking. For example, you can uniquely specify the operating system, architecture, and such of the victim machine. It's sending a fair amount of data over SMB to create that memory space and that buffer so it can release it. It takes a couple of seconds, but it does pop up and say it's been successful. And this is all it takes to compromise the machine. EternalBlue has been successful. The backdoor Trojan has been uploaded, and now we simply use the backdoor through the same console to upload later DLLs and eventually access the machine. Again, this can all be scripted and done exceptionally quickly. Network-based exploit, we specify IP address, port, architecture, and then it just goes. Go ahead and using double plus R. You obviously select the DLL you want to upload. I'm using Meterpreter. For those of you who can't see this, I'll be uploading this later so you can get a closer look. I apologize. Specify the process name we want our Meterpreter to spawn under, and then hit go, and you'll see the new process being spawned on the victim machine, shell being gained in Meterpreter, and away we go. Any second now. Apologies, that froze. Apparently, even with a video, the demo gods hate me. So here we go again. We've selected the process we want to execute under. We've selected our payload. It runs, and you see it being spawned. Meterpreter has picked up its connection. We have the Meterpreter shell there, and then we can drop straight to a Windows shell. Gives us system access on the remote machine, and you saw it spawn there. It's Command Exe. And we have system access on the remote machine. Now, you may be thinking, an internal network's fine, you have to compromise it first. Sure, this can be used to pop domain services on the internet, but who has TCP 445 open on the internet? A lot of people, for some strange reason. I remember in university 10 years ago being told that this was a bad idea, and we're still doing it. Shodan is continually scanning the internet for open top 1,000 ports. Finding domain services is not a tricky problem. I believe the AutoPwn framework will simply scan through here and pop every single one. Yeah. Don't do that. And this is the wider internet, where we're supposed to understand that having domain services exposed is a bad idea. What about your internal LAN? How many of you have domain services protected, restricted to domain controllers, for example? How many of it is just open to any machine that wants to try and connect to it? So the key part that I want people to take away from this, this talk is that there are many options that we can do when faced with exploits of this nature or advanced malware. We don't have to all be rock stars to look at these things and talk about them. It seems to be something that our industry has a bad habit of doing. So many of us are reliant on detections and information that comes out of these analyses. Yeah, a lot of us seem to have a fear of actually diving in and doing some of it because we can't come out with a complete result. So I'm going to step through 5 individual options here of things that I believe anyone with a basic security background, a basic networking development background can take steps and start to dive into the world of security research, talk about it a bit more, help build detections, and help the state of our industry. So the majority of these we're going to continue to look at EternalBlue, as we have been talking about it so far. So the main thing that I can talk about and suggest that you do with regards to these exploits and potential malware is get a hold of them. Get a copy, set up a virtual lab, run it. Don't worry about running it and thinking that you're going to get in trouble or you're going to break your machine. If you need to set up a virtual lab, there's plenty of resources online that can help you do so. I strongly advise going through a couple of them, getting a lab set up, different versions of Windows, different systems there. the SysInternal Suite and Wireshark are going to be your best friends for doing this. Process Explorer, Process Monitor, Wireshark, Autoruns, for example. A great selection of tools that can help you see exactly what these malware and these pieces of malware and exploits are doing on your systems. Once we have an idea of exactly how they're functioning, so we have taken our exploit in our lab, we've run it, we've caught network captures, and we've looked at exactly what they're interacting with on our local machine, we can take that information and compare it against what we know to be good. So the majority of these protocols are well documented. SMB was slightly less so when we were trying to identify exactly how it was functioning. But we're going to take these network captures that we have obtained and compare them against each other, compare them against known good traffic, and then compare them against the documents to see what exactly is going on and what is different from what is expected. And even that little piece of information can, if you communicate it out to the greater security community, can help us build detections and identify exactly how we can prevent these from spreading. So when we were talking earlier about the malformed NT-trans2 packet, with the majority of the payload information being sent, the example we have here is exactly what that looks like. Wireshark is great, and it pops up literally a big red bar telling you there's something wrong with that packet. You can dive into that and identify what is wrong when we're looking at the documents and looking at other parts of the protocol. The multiplex ID section of the SMB protocol is similar to a session ID in a way of putting it. It is established as part of your SMB session and is generally unique to that session. You will very, very rarely find similar ones. When we were analyzing EternalBlue, we identified that we had a very, very specific multiplex ID that was being used continually when the exploit was successful, or when the exploit was being run. When the exploit was being successful, double pulsar itself was installed, and then double pulsar itself was being used. So we identified 4 unique values in this multiplex ID that should generally be different every time you use SMB. And we we're able to build our detections, which we'll step onto next, around these unique values. So the way that the exploit was built was that because the multiplex ID is similar to a session, but not typically required, they were able to modify that value and have it as an identifying factor, both for themselves, and we were able to use that against the exploit to be able to identify it. So those 4 indicators that I was just discussing, the multiplex ID is 64 or 65 for the usage and success of EternalBlue, and 81, 82 for the installation of the double pulsar backdoor, were indicators that we were able to use to start to detect when EternalBlue was used. Once we have the information that allows us to create these detections, it's somewhere we can start to benefit the rest of the security industry and improve our own knowledge. From these indicators, we can use so many different solutions to be able to start to identify them within our network, presuming we have the architecture in place. So, intrusion detection solutions. So things like Suricata, proprietary solutions, Snort. These rules can be put in place and then you can detect that traffic moving across your network. You can do the same thing for the most part with net flow analysis, or using something like Moloch, a full packet capture. This is what the SMB packet looks like for that malformed NT-trans2 packet. The sections in red are the sections we're focusing on, as they are the identifying features of the attack that we can use to build our detection. You have the SMB header itself, which is encapsulated within TCP and IP. And then we have the 2 bytes of the specifying factor for the multiplex ID. This may look super complicated at first look. You take the red sections that we saw in the previous slide that are the identifying features of the exploit itself, and the rest of the rule just kind of falls around it. You've got the direction that you're looking for traffic in. You have the name that's going to pop up to an analyst when this rule triggers so they know what they're looking for. There are a couple of bits there that say exactly where within the packet that you are looking for that matching content. And those bits are important because it's possible that you may have some false positives. You're just generally looking for those bits across an entire packet. So we want to ensure that using this and using the flow bits, which are set at the bottom piece here. So you see we have the flow bits there. This is set very like a variable. For the initial rule that is triggered, that variable is set. And when the second rule triggers, so you can see we only have the single multiplex ID here, because they work in pairs, we have a second rule that triggers. And then once both of those rules trigger, you have your alert that goes to analyst. So you can be fairly sure that if this rule triggers, something is going on. And the difficulty in putting these together is not so difficult. There are some really great tutorials online, and I really advise people, if you're starting to look into how malware is functioning on the exploits, start to build these rules and start to communicate them out, because again, as I said earlier, we have so few people putting these together. Looking at impact identification for exploits specifically is something that is in dire need of doing. You have something like EternalBlue. When we first got it, we had no idea what versions of Windows were actually vulnerable to it. So get a hold of the exploit, like we've discussed previously, and just stick it into your lab and run it. Run it on everything from the oldest version of Windows you can get to the newest version. Every different release, every different patch. See if there's anything that you can identify in one of those versions that stops the exploit from working. And if you find one that doesn't work and you can't figure out why, reach out to the community. Everyone's there to help. One of the other cool things we were able to do, specifically because of how the double pulsar Trojan worked, was we were able to pretty much scan the internet. There are a couple of dudes out there in the States who have some pretty hefty boxes and are able to scan the entire of IPv4 address space for a single port in just under 4 hours. So that's what we did. Many of you will know Dan from Twitter. Worked pretty heavily with him on this analysis. We were able to identify within 4 days that the entirety of IPv4 address space had a 3% compromise rate. So that exploit had been out for 3 days. And this is where we got. The threat of how the exploit functions and the number of exploits included in the Shadow Brokers dump, as we said earlier, a lot of people, when we first started looking at it, were not concerned with exactly how severe it was. And then we have these numbers. That's a lot of machines. You want a botnet? There's a botnet. Once we have done the steps above, either in their entirety or a selection of them, we can start to provide mitigation advice. Security researchers, security professionals, we're the minority. We don't have a massive number. So the more people who can provide accurate advice, the better. The initial piece of advice that came from Microsoft was just patch. Just turn off your servers and patch them. Like, who's ready to turn off your production servers and patch them straight away? Like, I know we weren't. So what other options can we offer? One of the ones that NetPile came out with, who, for anyone who's unaware, is one of the Microsoft MVPs working on SMB. He's been part of the development of it for many years now. His advice was simply disable it. Unfortunately, and as he's now come to collate a list of, there are a number of legacy applications out there that require SMB v1. They literally don't work without it. You can't turn off that version in your environment if you're using one of these applications. It'll simply bring you to your knees. So it may seem like there's not many other options. And this is where coming back to our detections comes in play. So what we did at Riot, and I'm fairly proud of how we handled this because we jumped into it pretty quickly. So the IDS detections that we discussed earlier, we built them, put them in place, and we're able to identify the instances where EternalBlue was used within our environment. So fairly convenient, we got that in place quickly. We performed external scans of our address space to ensure that we had no exposed SMB. Anything that was sitting there with that exposed was a threat to the company and was sealed off. And the final step we took was, due to the nature of SMB and how it's used within an environment and how the exploit was being used when it was seen in the wild, because it was used so much for lateral movement, we used Windows Firewall and some solutions that we have in place and completely limited SMB use within workstation to workstation. At Riot, we prefer not to have that inter-workstation communication, and if you can implement that in your environments, that may protect you from the exploits being used against you. Finally, and this one may not hit all of you, if you've done any binary analysis, it may be more common, but it's always worth throwing a malicious binary into a disassembler. Top image there may look super complicated, and, well, it is super complicated. Anyone recognize this URL? This is the WannaCry sinkhole URL. You don't have to decode it. You don't have to search for it. The second you chuck the WannaCry binary into IDAPRO, it's the first thing that comes up. You can chuck it as strings, it may come up there as well. Binary Ninja, potentially free if you don't have IDAPRO. Sometimes the simplest things are right under your nose. Just takes that little bit of assessment to be able to identify it. If you're interested in binary reverse engineering, the WannaCry binary, whilst if you run it, could cause you trouble. Pulling it apart is kind of fun. So, someone has chucked a new set of exploits on the internet. There's a new ransomware or a new rat going around that you figure someone's going to look at eventually and get you some detections for them. It's like, why wait? Get yourself a copy of that binary. Set yourself up a virtual lab. Run it. Don't worry about it. And if it's in your lab, when you have your lab set up correctly, you're going to be fairly safe. You're not going to risk compromising your home network or hopefully not your work network. And then talk about it. The biggest thing that we've had trouble with people doing analysis is they won't talk about it. They'll do their small section and they'll turn around and say, oh, well, I did this a little bit and nothing really came of it, so I didn't tell anyone about it. And even if you don't have necessarily all the experience to be able to jump in and make a direct conclusion, take these small steps. Reach out to the security industry and ask for help or just talk about it. Blog about it. Jump onto Discord. We have things like the Many Hats Club, which is a security community that's built up very recently, and we all take turns at helping each other. Jump into these communities. Yeah, Twitter can be a bit of a shitstorm, but apart from that, the community is fairly good there to help. Don't talk in a silo, and don't run dodgy shit on your main machine. I'd like to thank these three guys. There was a group of us that worked on this when it first came out. Again, not working in a silo. Dan Tentler, Ronnie Day, and Kevin. Fantastic guys, you should all follow, and I should be able to provide you with any further insight into these. And you drop me any questions as well if you have them. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions I can try and answer?
With regards to setting up labs, when you mentioned a blog that talks about how you set up labs. So you mentioned setting up labs, and obviously you said you got a blog post that says how to set up labs. Are those locally hosted, like VMs on your machine, or are you talking about external? No,
those are locally hosted on your machine. When you're doing binary analysis for malware or like exploits, it's generally not the best to do it across the network because there's always the chance of cross-contamination. It can be done, but it's better to do it locally. Cool, thank you very much.